So imagine your own country has just lost a brutal multi-front war, a devastating 4-year ordeal that has left millions dead, your economy entirely bankrupt, and your government practically dissolved.
Right.
The massive complex structure you have called home for centuries has effectively collapsed around you. You are standing in the rubble. Your first instinct, assuming you have any fight left in you, might naturally be to resist the wrecking crew standing outside.
That is the standard assumption, yes.
But what if, instead, you and your neighbors looked at that crew, the very people who just demolished your structure, and politely asked them to take over the management of your neighborhood?
It is a scenario that fundamentally short-circuits our modern understanding of national pride. We are, culturally conditioned to expect an immediate, defiant resistance against a foreign conqueror.
Exactly.
We assume that the human instinct for sovereignty will automatically override the sheer shock of a civilizational collapse. But when you examine the granular reality of defeat on the ground using the primary sources from the time, human psychology operates very differently.
And that counterintuitive reality is what the documents from the early Turkish War of Independence show us. Specifically, the incredibly volatile window immediately following World War I, right after the signing of the Mondros Armistice, spanning roughly from late 1918 to 1920.
Right, because the popular retrospective narrative of this period usually paints a picture of an instantaneous, unified uprising by the defeated Ottoman populace against the victorious Allied powers, the British, the French, and the Italians.
Yeah, the myth is that the moment the armistice was signed, the nation rose up as one to throw off the chains of global imperialism.
But when you actually read the primary historical documents, the military telegraphs, and the personal diaries from that exact moment, they tell a completely different story. The defeated populace did not rise up against the British and French right away.
They actually welcomed them in many cases, or at least they accepted the occupation with a bizarre sense of relief.
Precisely. The spark of resistance did not ignite against the distant imperial powers. It only caught fire when those occupying forces made the fatal administrative decision to utilize local Armenian and Greek militias to enforce their rule.
I see.
The struggle began not as a grand ideological war for independence, but as a desperate, highly localized fight for survival against neighboring ethnic groups.
So it is a story about the complex psychology of a traumatized nation. Let us look at the differing strategies of the occupying empires. To really understand how this dynamic played out, we should trace the violence back to its absolute origin.
Yes, we need to look at the very first shots fired in this conflict, because the anatomy of that initial clash sets the template for everything that follows.
Let us examine that timeline. Winston Churchill actually made a fascinating observation about the immediate aftermath of the war in his writings.
He did.
He wrote that when the defeated Turkey finally lifted its head from the carnage of World War I and realized that the ultimate victor was England, the nation essentially breathed a collective sigh of relief.
It speaks to a profound psychological exhaustion. The Ottoman Empire had been at war almost continuously since 1911. First in Libya, then the Balkan Wars, and finally the absolute meat grinder of the First World War.
Right, the populace was entirely blood dry.
Submitting to the British Empire felt, in a strange way, like a return to a known geopolitical order. But that sigh of relief was incredibly short-lived in certain specific regions, and it had everything to do with who the British and French brought with them.
If we look at the exact date, the very first bullet of the resistance was not fired in some grand battle in the capital. It was fired on December 19, 1918, in a small southern town called Dortschul.
And the target is the crucial detail here.
Yeah, the target of that bullet was not a French soldier. It was fired at Armenians who were walking through the town wearing French military uniforms.
This is where we have to unpack the geopolitics that led to that specific moment. Why are local Armenians wearing French uniforms in an Ottoman town in 1918?
We have to rewind to the summer of 1916 for that, right? In London.
Correct. This involves the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement. But beyond just drawing lines on a map, the French representative, François-Georges Picot, and the British representative, Mark Sykes, held strategic meetings with an Armenian leader named Bogos Nubar Pasha.
Okay.
They established a formal agreement to create something called the Eastern Legion, which would later be renamed the Armenian Legion.
What was the strategic logic behind that from the French perspective? France was a massive global empire. Why did they need to build a specific ethnic legion to fight in this one region?
The sources outline two main reasons. First, the explicit purpose of this legion was to fight the Ottoman army in the Cilicia region, that is, the southern area encompassing modern-day Adana, Marash, and Antep. The French envisioned this military unit serving as the foundational core of a future small Armenian state that would operate under a French protectorate. It was a standard imperial strategy of establishing a client state.
And the second reason?
Manpower. By 1916, and certainly by 1918, the French military was experiencing catastrophic losses on the Western Front. Verdun and the Somme had hollowed out a generation of Frenchmen.
Right.
France simply did not have the surplus regular troops to project overwhelming force into its newly acquired colonial territories in the Middle East. They desperately needed proxy forces.
So they outsourced the occupation. They relied heavily on this Eastern Legion to enforce their rule in the South. But the French command had to know this was highly volatile.
One would assume so.
We are talking about 1918.
Mm-hmm.
Just 3 years prior, in 1915, the Ottoman government enacted the mass deportation and exile of the Armenian population. The trauma and the desire for vengeance would be completely fresh.
It was an administrative decision that practically guaranteed intercommunal violence. Many of the soldiers recruited into this Eastern Legion were the very individuals who had survived the 1915 exiles. They were returning to their former hometowns, now armed, backed by a global superpower, and possessing deeply rooted grievances. The French completely ignored the localized psychological reality in favor of cheap imperial enforcement.
It is essentially outsourcing municipal security to a rival faction. It is engineered to create conflict. And when you look at the specific incidents, you see exactly how this played out on the ground.
Yes, take the events at Erzurli village, which is just south of Dordial.
What do the documents say happened there?
Well, when the local Armenians, heavily backed and emboldened by the French military umbrella, began acts of looting, extortion, and violence against the local Turkish population, the Turks did not immediately declare a war of national liberation against France.
This is the detail that really highlights the mindset of the era. The Turkish villagers, led by a local figure named Emin Hoca, formed a delegation. But they did not go to the mountains to start a guerrilla war.
No, they did not.
They actually went to the British occupation command.
Exactly. They bypassed the French entirely and appealed to the other occupying empire. They formally requested that the British intervene and protect them from the French-backed forces.
They're essentially asking one occupying power to save them from the proxy of another occupying power.
And the mechanism of the British response is vital to understand. The British command actually listened. They dispatched a detachment of British Indian troops, specifically Hindu soldiers, to Dortial, which temporarily pacified the situation.
I really want to focus on that detail for a second. The local Turkish population was perfectly willing to submit to a foreign military authority.
Yes, they were.
They had no problem with British Indian troops policing their streets. Their issue was not the concept of being occupied. Their issue was exclusively with who was doing the occupying.
That is the core dynamic of the early post-war period. The populace had internalized their defeat. They accepted that losing a world war meant foreign occupation. What they could not accept was having the social and ethnic hierarchy of their own homeland inverted by a proxy militia. But the French command either failed to grasp this nuance or simply did not care. They continued to permit the retaliatory actions of the Armenian legionnaires.
Which brings us to the escalation at Kerkez village.
Right. After the residents of Kerkez witnessed the unrest in Erzurli and heard reports of village elders being killed, the survival instinct kicked in. They took direct physical action.
But again, not against a French base.
No, they'd build rudimentary stone barricades across the dirt roads leading into their village. It was essentially a quarantine measure. And when a French military detachment attempted to enter Kerkez, the villagers fought back.
And the makeup of that detachment is important.
Yes, it is crucial to note that this French detachment was heavily populated with Armenian soldiers from the Legion. The villagers opened fire, a skirmish broke out, and the detachment was ultimately forced to retreat after suffering 15 casualties.
And that skirmish, a defensive action by a single village against a localized proxy force, is what the records show as the true first armed resistance of the Turkish War of Independence.
Exactly.
It was not a coordinated strike against European imperialism. It was a defensive reflex against a familiar neighbor wearing a new uniform.
This localized nature of the resistance allows us to perform a fascinating comparative analysis based on the archival data. Because if the French strategy of outsourcing their occupation to traumatize local militias caused immediate chaos, we have to ask why the entire southern region of Anatolia was not engulfed in flames simultaneously.
Right, because if you look at the map of the occupation zones at that time, the British were right next door. And yet the cities under British control were completely quiet.
They were.
This brings us to the academic concept of the varying administrative styles of the occupiers. The strategy the British used in cities like Adana, Antep, Marash, and Urfa actually pacified the local Turkish population completely.
The mechanism of British imperial control was vastly different from the French approach. The British Empire relied on presenting an aura of absolute, unshakable competency and impartial administration.
They recognized the danger of the proxy forces.
Yes, they explicitly recognized the explosive potential of using local proxies with historical grievances, so they actively removed them from their zones.
The documents from December 1918 show this, right?
Correct. The British High Commissioner in Istanbul, Admiral Calthorpe, sent formal protests to General Allenby, who was commanding the occupation of the Cilicia region. Calthorpe explicitly detailed the crimes and provocations being committed by the Armenian forces in places like Payas and Dorchiol.
And General Allenby actually takes military action against his own coalition's proxy forces. He initiates strict measures to pull Armenian units back from forward operating positions.
He did.
By March of 1919, he completely disbands the 4th Armenian Battalion. He puts them on ships and transports them entirely out of the theater, down to Port Said in Egypt.
Allenby even proposed a formal plan to relocate the entire Armenian Legion to Morocco. The French, understandably prioritizing their own colonial ambitions, flatly refused. But the psychological impact of Allenby's actions on the local Turkish population in the British zones is heavily documented.
It must have functioned as a form of administrative validation.
Official military history publications from the Turkish General Staff confirm this. They note that the British astutely recognized how the provocations by the Armenians were acting as a catalyst, creating a constant reaction among the Turks.
Right, a localized friction.
Yes, the British feared this friction would eventually ignite a general, uncontrollable uprising that would require massive British resources to suppress, so they eliminated the friction point.
The results of that administrative choice are quite clear in the historical record. During the entire period of British occupation, places like Antep, Marash, and Urfa saw absolutely zero armed resistance.
Zero.
These are the very same cities that would, just a year later, become renowned for their fierce resistance against the French. But under the British, they were docile.
The local notables, the wealthy landowners, the religious leaders, the elite of these provinces felt entirely secure under British administration. They felt so secure, in fact, that they did not even bother sending delegates to the Sivas Congress.
The Sivas Congress being the foundational gathering organized by Ataturk to build the national resistance movement.
Exactly. The elites of the South essentially analyzed the situation and concluded they did not need a resistance movement. The British were maintaining property rights, they were maintaining the social order, and they were keeping local rivals in check.
So the resistance only materialized when the geopolitical chessboard shifted.
Yes. In late 1919, adhering to the overarching Sykes-Picot Agreement, the British began handing these specific territories over to French control. And the diplomatic fallout of that handover was instantaneous in the documents.
The transcripts from the London Conference in February 1920 are fascinating on this exact point. You have the highest levels of the British government openly criticizing French administrative incompetence in front of the international community.
British Prime Minister Lloyd George laid out the timeline very clearly. He pointed out that up until September 1919, the Marash region was under British occupation, and absolute order was maintained.
Right.
He argued forcefully that the Turkish nationalist movement only gained traction in the south and only became a military threat because the territory was handed to the French.
Did he mention the troops specifically?
Yes. He specifically cited the fact that more than two-thirds of the incoming French occupation forces consisted of Algerian colonial troops and local Armenians.
And Lord Curzon backed him up, essentially stating that maintaining an empire required regular troops, not local minorities. And it was not just the British saying this.
No, the Americans noted it too.
The United States High Commissioner in Istanbul, Admiral Bristol, sent urgent warnings back to Washington. He explicitly stated that the French policy of using Armenian soldiers and arming the local Armenian populace was the direct cause of the Turkish nationalist intervention in the South.
We can observe the psychological shock of this transition perfectly documented in the city of Kilis. The historian Professor Gökbilgin provides a deeply detailed academic account of the mood there.
What does Gökbilgin say?
He notes that Kilis was perfectly tranquil under British occupation. The British troops stationed there were predominantly Hindu Muslims from India. They were disciplined, they did not interfere with the religious or daily lives of the locals, and they strictly protected property rights.
Bilgen makes a really insightful analytical point about this. He writes that this outwardly mild, competent British policy was actually acting as an anesthetic. It was deadening the nation's spirit of resistance.
Competent imperialism puts the defensive instincts of a defeated nation to sleep. But the moment the anesthetic wears off, the moment the news breaks that the British are withdrawing and the French are arriving, the localized panic is absolute.
The residents of Keelys were terrified because they'd been reading the daily reports of the unrest occurring under French administration in the neighboring Adana region.
This sheer dread produced some highly paradoxical events. As the French columns began arriving to replace the British, the local Turkish elites attempted to negotiate the terms of their own subjugation.
Like the events in Maraş.
Yes, in Maraş, a group of prominent local notables, known as the Beyazıtzadeler, actually organized and threw a massive, lavish banquet to welcome the incoming French commanders.
A welcome banquet for the incoming occupying army. It shows the extreme lengths of elite self-preservation.
It does. And in the town of Kozan, another group of notables formally presented themselves to the French administration. They delivered a message stating that they would fully accept French occupation, submit to French laws, and pay French taxes on one strict condition.
That no Armenians were involved in the administration or the military garrison.
Precisely. The desperation reaches all the way to international diplomacy. The elite of Maraş drafted a telegram signed by the governor and the most prominent citizens of the city and sent it directly to the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Paris.
They begged the French government to assign a specific commander, right?
Yes, the French military governor of Osmaniye, a man named Andrea, to Maraş. They were attempting to select their preferred administrator.
The prominent writer and intellectual Fali Rafka Atay documented how pervasive this mindset was. He noted that even the vanguard of the nascent national forces operating in secret in Istanbul was sending messages to the people of Urfa, Maraş, and Antep.
Advising them to try to appear favorable to the French.
Right. Do whatever it takes to keep the peace. They are essentially pleading for occupation by regular, professional French troops or North African Muslim colonial troops, just not the local proxy forces.
The psychology here is intricate but highly rational given the historical context. Submitting to the regular army of the British or French Empire was recognized as an institutional consequence of losing a global war.
Yeah.
However, submitting to a locally recruited militia comprised of historical ethnic rivals was perceived not just as a military defeat, but as a total inversion of the natural social order. It was an existential threat.
This analysis indicates that the technical breach of the Mondros Armistice by the imperial powers did not, in itself, generate significant resistance. The resistance in the South was a reactionary mechanism directed almost entirely against the proxy forces.
And this mechanism was not isolated to the French zones. If we shift our focus to the Eastern Front, we see an almost identical pattern unfold in the documents. Only this time, the British were the ones who triggered the conflict through their geopolitical policies.
Let us break down the Eastern Front. The situation there is incredibly complex due to the power vacuum left by the Russian Empire collapsing in 1917.
Exactly. Following the withdrawal of Russian forces, the local Muslim populations realized they were entirely exposed administratively. In November 1918, a local Turkish Islamic council was established in the city of Kars to maintain some semblance of order and governance.
Now, when the British military arrives in Kars in January 1919, under the command of General Beach, the Islamic Council does not declare war against them.
Not at all. They immediately opened diplomatic channels. The Islamic Council established excellent working relations with General Beach.
I see.
In fact, Beach found them so cooperative and effective at maintaining local order that he decided to formally recognize the council as a legitimate administrative body.
They were so emboldened by this British tolerance that they held a Congress in January and formed the Southwestern Caucasus Provisional National Government. And they managed to maintain functional relations with the British military administration.
But that coexistence was built on a fragile policy foundation, and it shattered entirely due to a specific directive emanating from London.
What was the directive?
The British overarching strategic goal for the region included the creation of a viable Armenian state, serving partly as a buffer against future Russian expansion.
Right.
To achieve this, the British command insisted that the thousands of Armenian refugees who had fled the region must be allowed to return to Kars, and more importantly, that the local administration should facilitate this return and share power.
And for the Turkish Kars government, that was an absolute red line. They firmly rejected the British demand. They calculated that allowing a massive demographic shift back into the region would end their political control.
This refusal forced the hand of the higher British command. General Milne, who was overseeing the broader region, sent a report to the War Office in London in February 1919.
Detailing the situation.
Yes, he laid out the situation clearly. The Muslim Council was getting along fine with the British military administration, and there was no anti-British hostility. However, their refusal to facilitate the return of the Armenians meant that their attitude had to be forcibly changed or the council had to be eliminated entirely. The geopolitical goal superseded the local stability.
So the British resort to military force. In April 1919, they arrest the key members of the Turkish Kars government, exile them to Malta, and hand the administration of Kars over to Armenian officials.
That single administrative action was the spark that ignited the Eastern Front. It instantly catalyzed the formation of fierce local militias in surrounding areas like Altu and Kazazman.
What is analytically fascinating here is how the fear of a great Armenia functioned as a massive unifying force.
It did. The region was incredibly fractured ethnically, primarily between Turks and Kurds. The British intelligence services were highly active in the East, attempting to exploit this fracture.
Divide and conquer.
Yes, they spent considerable effort trying to drive a wedge between the two groups. They offered powerful Kurdish tribal leaders promises of autonomy, cash bribes, and weapons to secure a Kurdish-Armenian alignment against the emerging Turkish national movement.
But the strategy failed because the shared terror of an expanding Armenian state neutralized those British bribes. The perceived threat of subjugation was so acute that it united the Kurds and the Turks.
General Milne admits this failure in a highly classified report from July 1919. He wrote to London that the mere mention of the word Great Armenia inflames the fire of the national movement. He stated it brings the Kurds right back side by side with the Turks.
He realized the localized ethnic conflict completely superseded the grand geopolitical machinations.
To truly grasp the depths of the regional exhaustion, we have to look at a coded telegram sent in September 1919. It was sent by Haydar, the Ottoman governor of Van, to General Kazım Karabekir, who was commanding the remaining Ottoman forces in the east.
What does Haydar state in the telegram?
Haydar provides an unfiltered assessment of the public mood. He states that the populace was so profoundly battered by the endless mobilizations of World War I, the famine, and the disease that they felt completely alienated from both the Ottoman government in Istanbul and the army itself.
Right.
He explicitly wrote that the people were so desperate for rest that they would have welcomed anyone with satisfaction, any foreign power, simply to have peace, with one massive exception.
Anyone but the Armenians.
Precisely. They would take British rule, French rule, Italian rule, just not the Armenians.
So synthesizing the data from the South and the East, a very clear picture emerges. The early resistance was absolutely driven by a highly regionalized fear of being subjugated by newly empowered historical minority rivals.
That is the fractured reality that Mustafa Kemal, the man who would become Ataturk, inherited when he began organizing the national movement.
Which brings us to the political debate at the Sivas Congress in September 1919. Ataturk realized that this regional fear was potent fuel, but it was disorganized.
Yes, he had to harness the hatred of the Greek and Armenian occupations to build a unified movement without accidentally provoking the Allied powers into crushing his nascent movement prematurely.
Let us examine the mechanics of that debate at Sivas. If you look at the initial drafts of the declarations prepared for the prior Erzurum Congress and then Sivas, the language is incredibly specific.
Very specific.
The drafts explicitly state that the goal of the national resistance is strictly directed against the establishment of Greek and Armenian states on Ottoman territory. There is no mention of throwing out the British or the French.
During the Sivas Congress, this highly targeted wording caused a major ideological debate. You had prominent delegates like Mazhar Mufid Bey and Fazıl Pasha who read the draft and argued that targeting only Greeks and Armenians was far too narrow.
What was their structural argument?
Mazhar Mufid Bey pointed to the map. He noted that Italy was currently occupying the regions of Antalya and Konya. He argued that if the official declaration only mentioned resisting Greek and Armenian statehood, it implicitly sent a message that the movement accepted Italian, British, and French occupation.
So He demanded the text be broadened to declare resistance against all foreign occupation.
Exactly. But Ataturk vehemently pushes back against this.
Why did he push back?
Because Ataturk was a supreme military and political pragmatist. He argued that explicitly declaring a multi-front war on the British Empire, the French Republic, and the Kingdom of Italy simultaneously would terrify the already exhausted Turkish public.
He knew that fighting the British did not possess the emotional resonance needed to motivate the rural population, but fighting the local Greek or Armenian militia did.
Exactly. He wanted to keep the target locked purely on the Greek and Armenian threat, because that was the only issue that actually possessed the power to motivate the people. But there was also a highly complex legal dimension revolving around the Mondros Armistice.
Let us talk about Article 7 of the Mondros Armistice. It contained a clause that technically gave the Allied powers the legal right to occupy any strategic point in the Ottoman Empire if they felt their security was threatened.
It was a blank check for occupation. Ataturk understood that if the Sivas Congress openly defied the armistice by declaring war on the Entente powers, they would immediately cross the line into being a rogue, illegal rebellion against the internationally recognized peace process.
And the consequences of being labeled a rogue rebellion would be severe.
Extremely. First, the Ottoman government in Istanbul, led by the Sultan, would be forced by the British to declare Ataturk a traitor. Second, it would invite the full military wrath of the British and French armies before the nationalist forces had enough rifles to equip a single division.
Ataturk had to maintain strategic ambiguity. If we look at the actual transcripts from Sivas, Mazar Mufid Bey argues passionately that the armistice is a dead letter because the Allies have already violated it.
And Ataturk counters him with cold logic. He explains that when the draft was written back in Erzurum, the committee intentionally avoided mentioning the Entente powers. They feel that if the public saw a declaration of war against the victors of World War I, the nation would refuse to participate.
Ataturk even dismisses the Italian occupation in the transcripts. He tells Mazar Mufid Bey that the Italian presence in Antalya is just a reactionary move triggered by the Greek occupation of Izmir.
Yes, he insists on keeping the wording laser-focused on preventing the establishment of Greek or Armenian states.
It is a strategy of localized focus. He knew how fragile the public mood was.
Yeah.
He had to build a national army using the localized fear of the Greeks and Armenians as the only available fuel, deliberately avoiding a direct confrontation with the British Empire.
And to fully understand why Ataturk had to treat the British with such caution at Sivas, we have to look back to the moment the war ended to examine how the Ottoman leadership actually viewed the British in late 1918.
This is the phenomenon of the Mondros delusion.
Yes. When the guns fell silent, the Ottoman elite did not view the British as conquerors to be fought. They viewed them as old, temporarily estranged friends who were returning to restore order.
If we break down the signing of the Mondros Armistice in October 1918, it was by any objective military standard an instrument of total surrender.
It demanded the demobilization of the Ottoman army, the severing of all external communications, and Allied control of the railways.
Yet when the Ottoman delegation returned to Istanbul, the signing of this document was celebrated as a massive diplomatic victory by the Istanbul press. How is that possible?
The man primarily responsible was Rauf Orbey, the Minister of Marine who signed the document on behalf of the Ottoman Empire. Rauf Orbey genuinely believed he had achieved a triumph.
What was the logic behind his belief?
Orbey was operating under a deeply entrenched 19th century geopolitical worldview. He held a steadfast belief that the British Empire fundamentally desired a strong, territorially intact, independent Turkey in the Middle East.
To serve as a buffer state.
Exactly, to block Russian expansion into the Mediterranean and towards India. He is heavily relying on the historical memory of the Crimean War from the 1850s, when Britain and France fought alongside the Ottomans against the Russian Tsar.
That alliance was etched into the institutional memory. Orbey rationalized the First World War as a tragic misunderstanding pushed by a few radical leaders.
Yeah.
He genuinely believed the British ruling class was honorable and friendly to the Turks.
Rauf Orbey returns to Istanbul and immediately begins manipulating the press to construct this alternate reality. He holds a major press conference assuring the journalists that the British commanders were highly sympathetic.
He publicly declared that the sovereignty of the state was fully protected, and he made a promise that not a single enemy soldier would set foot in the capital of Istanbul.
Which is an untenable promise when the treaty explicitly says the Allies control the straits leading directly to Istanbul. But this mechanism of denial infected the entire government.
Look at the Ottoman parliament. It was still dominated by the remaining members of the Committee of Union and Progress.
The Unionists, yes.
When the terms of Mondros are presented to them in a secret session, they unanimously approve it. They enthusiastically vote for it, convincing themselves that the core sovereignty of the empire had been preserved.
This collective delusion was heavily predicated on the empty Greek guarantee. The deepest fear of the Ottoman elite was the prospect of Greek forces being involved in the occupation. Raf Orbe believed he had won a massive secret concession at Mondros regarding this fear.
He possessed a secret letter from the British signatory Admiral Calthorpe, right?
Yes. Orbe interpreted this letter as an ironclad British guarantee that Greek troops would not be permitted to occupy Istanbul. But when you read the text of Calthorpe's letter, it is a masterpiece of diplomatic non-commitment.
Calthorpe simply wrote that he had communicated the request of the Ottoman government to his superiors.
Exactly. Calthorpe had strict orders from London not to make binding commitments regarding the Greek navy. And predictably, just days after Orbe promised no enemy soldier would land, the Allied fleet sailed into the Bosphorus.
And mixed right in with the British dreadnoughts were Greek warships, including the armored cruiser Avarov. It was a visual confirmation of defeat.
Despite the British immediately occupying the oil fields of Mosul and sending detachments into the interior, there was almost no immediate reaction from the Ottoman establishment. They convinced themselves these deployments were temporary liaison missions.
The historical texts note that Ataturk was practically the only high-ranking military figure who saw through this delusion immediately. In November, he sent urgent warnings to the Grand Vizier Izzet Pasha.
He explicitly stated that the British were not benevolent friends and that if the government did not push back, the British would soon be dictating the Ottoman cabinet.
It is a clear manifestation of cognitive dissonance within the society. The reality of total defeat clashed with their imperial identity. To bridge that gap, they invented a narrative that they yielded to a civilized friend.
But that peaceful delusion was destined to shatter, and it arrived forcefully on May 15, 1919. This brings us to the Greek catalyst. If the Armenian militias sparked the localized resistance in the east and the south, it was the arrival of the Greeks that sparked it in the west.
The Greek occupation of Izmir was a long-anticipated event. Yet, the sources show there was no serious military preparation for resistance within the city itself.
There were local defense organizations like the Rejection of Annexation Committee, but their methodology is deeply revealing. They did not stockpile weapons or train militias. Their primary strategy was diplomatic pleading.
They drafted telegrams begging the Entente powers, the British, the French, the Americans, to occupy Izmir instead of allowing the Greeks to do it.
The reaction the day before the landing perfectly encapsulates the psychological state. The British representatives in Izmir, James Morgan and Commodore Ian Smith, informed the Ottoman governor, Vali Izzet, that the Greek army would land the following morning.
And a young Turkish officer present at the meeting actually stated that while the Turks could tolerate being ruled by a great power like Britain, they could never tolerate being occupied by the Greeks.
And Vali Izzet's reaction is even more indicative. The historical accounts note that upon receiving the official note, the governor of Izmir broke down and burst into tears.
Right.
He literally begged the British Commodore to just send 200 or 300 Allied sailors to land first and raise their flags to create a visual illusion that it was a joint Allied operation.
The British refused, citing orders from the Supreme Council at the Paris Peace Conference. And the new prime minister in Istanbul, Demet Ferit, frantically delivered formal diplomatic notes to the Allied High Commissioners.
Demet Ferit explicitly stated to the victors that the Ottoman government would not offer the slightest opposition to an occupation by the regular armies of the Entente powers, but they would never consent to a Greek occupation.
He even told the Italian High Commissioner, Count Sforza, that if only a great power loved by the Turks had occupied Izmir, everything would be different.
This fundamentally reframes our analytical understanding of the origins of the Western Front. The armed resistance in the Aegean region did not begin as an ideological stand against foreign imperial intervention.
No.
It began as a biological rejection of a specific foreign power, Greece, because the Greeks were viewed as an existential demographic threat due to the Megali idea.
And even after the Greek invasion began, the leaders of the emerging resistance maintained this reliance on the British. In August 1919, two major congresses were held in the towns of Alatyr and Zili by the actual armed resistance leaders.
And what do these militia commanders do? They draft official telegrams and send them directly to the commander of the British Army in the region, General Milne.
The Alger Congress explicitly promised General Milne that they harbored absolutely zero hostility toward the Entente powers. They stated that opposing the Allied powers was an empty thought.
They practically begged the British to intervene, promising that if a civilized Allied power occupied the region instead of the Greek army, the militias would gladly accept the occupation.
The Nazili Congress sent a nearly identical telegram just 4 days later. They promised that if the British ordered their troops to clear the Greeks out, the Turkish militias would immediately dissolve their units and return to their villages under British rule.
It disrupts the modern myth of an uncompromising anti-imperial war from day one. The existential threat was the neighbor, not the distant empire, and this desire for a British mandate permeated the minds of the actual fighters on the ground.
We see this in the British intelligence reports from 1919. A detailed report from a British control officer in Akhisar in September confirms this.
Yes.
The officer states unequivocally that the Turkish militias forming in the hills were created solely to fight the Greek army.
The report notes that whenever the British officer encountered Turkish fighters, they explained they were not against the Allies. The intelligence concluded the Turks seemed completely willing to remain under the temporary control of another great power.
The officer explicitly noted there was absolutely no organized armed resistance among the Turkish population until the Greek army began committing widespread atrocities as they advanced inland.
The report summarized that the Turks would be highly amenable to a military occupation by Great Britain or the United States. Because of this widespread reverence, British officers wandering alone through Anatolia to dismantle the resistance were treated as honored guests.
They were viewed as potential saviors due to the immense imperial prestige of the British Empire. The local populations desperately hoped the British would correct the geopolitical mistake of the Greek and Armenian occupations.
This mindset produces historical paradoxes. Consider Hassan Tassim. He is celebrated as the hero who fired the first bullet at the Greek forces in Izmir on May 15. Yet the historical record reveals that just months before the landing, he founded a pro-British political society in Izmir. He wrote articles arguing that Britain, France, and America were the ultimate defenders of justice.
He actively argued that the Turks must do absolutely nothing to anger the victorious allies. Even as the Greek armada was arriving, he wrote an editorial stating he could not believe the Entente powers would allow such an injustice.
And we see this deference among the major militia commanders. Demirci Mehmet Ife, one of the most powerful militia leaders in the Aegean, had a meeting with a British intelligence officer, Captain Hadkinson.
Hadkinson was trying to convince the militias to disarm, and Demirci Mehmet Efe essentially outlined a preference for British colonization. He told the spy that the Turks would vastly prefer control by a larger, more enlightened state like Great Britain.
The most remarkable example comes from the Eastern Front in General Kazım Karabekir's memoirs. A Turkish village successfully fought off an Armenian militia and captured 2 artillery cannons.
But shortly after, 2 men wearing British officers' uniforms walked into the village. They claimed the cannons were British property and simply took them away.
And the villagers just let them. As General Karabekir noted, it was later discovered those men were local Armenians who had fabricated fake British uniforms. The psychological power of the British uniform was so overwhelming that the village surrendered their weapons without a question.
That perfectly encapsulates the monumental challenge facing the founders of the Republic. How did Ataturk manage to break that spell and convince the nation to declare full independence?
That brings us to the final phase, overcoming the paralysis of fear. The institutionalized psychological subservience to the British infected even the highest-ranking Ottoman generals.
The story of the governor of Erzurum, Rashid Pasha, illustrates this. Erzurum was the stronghold of the nationalist movement, with General Karabekir commanding a 15,000-man Turkish army corps.
Yet when Ataturk ordered the arrest of Allied control officers in retaliation for British actions in Istanbul, Rashid Pasha was utterly terrified of arresting the single British officer in Erzurum, Colonel Rawlinson.
The governor asked Karabekir, "What if Rawlinson occupies the telegraph office to control our communications?" His mind could not process the physical power dynamic.
We see this exact hesitance with General Nurettin Pasha, a decorated commander who traveled to Ankara to join Ataturk. During a strategic meeting, Nurettin Pasha demanded clarity on whether they intended to fight the British Empire.
He argued it was mathematically impossible for a ruined nation to fight a global empire.
Ataturk managed this psychological fragility with strategic vagueness. He stated calmly that their only goal was achieving full independence within their national borders, and they would fight whoever stands in the way of that specific goal. He did not name the British.
Ataturk engaged in a methodical process. He used the visceral hatred of the Greek army in the west and the Armenian militias in the east and south as the primary engine to build a centralized army.
By the time the Turkish public realized they also had to dismantle the proxy strategies of the British Empire and the Ottoman Sultanate, the population was already organized, armed, and winning battles.
The writer Fali Rifka Tay summarized this by stating that if the Greek army had never landed in Izmir on May 15, 1919, fighting a war against the great powers would have been psychologically and politically impossible. He called the Greek invasion the hand of God. It is a profound academic observation. The Allied powers accidentally engineered their own defeat by outsourcing the military occupation to the Greeks and local Armenian militias. They provided the fractured nationalist movement with the exact enemy required to unite a broken people. The historical reality is filled with contradictions, cognitive dissonance, and bitter local rivalries superseding national interests. The early Turkish War of Independence was initially a chaotic, localized fight for survival against neighboring ethnic groups.
And it was hampered by a paralyzing psychological subservience to the British Empire, which was slowly overcome by pragmatic leadership in Ankara. Understanding this complexity makes the ultimate historical achievement far more remarkable.
It encourages us to look at all modern conflicts with a nuanced analytical eye, which leaves us with a final thought to mull over. We have spent this time unpacking how the myth of an instantaneous anti-imperial uprising was crafted after the fact, while the reality of begging for a British mandate was swept under the rug. It makes you wonder, if you look closely at the founding myths of your own country, what inconvenient, deeply human truths were edited out by the victors to make the story sound better. Remember that collapsed building we talked about at the start. Sometimes the hardest part of rebuilding a nation is not fighting the wrecking crew outside. It is convincing the traumatized people inside the rubble that they are actually strong enough to be their own architects.